She had my father's car crushed into a cube of scrap metal before I even got home from his funeral, and she smiled while she did it. My name is Alexander Cole, and this is the story of how a suburban tyrant with a laminated rulebook destroyed the last piece of my father I had left, and how I made her pay for every single bolt. I live in Meadow Hollow Estates, a gated community outside Columbus, Ohio, where the lawns are always green and the smiles are always fake. I moved into my dad's old house 6 months after he passed, inheriting his 1969 Chevrolet Camaro SS along with it, the car he spent 22 years restoring by hand. I never imagined a woman named Karen Whitfield would turn that car into a crime scene. Karen was the president of our homeowners association, and she ruled Meadow Hollow like a queen who'd never been told no. She had silver hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful, and a smile that never once reached her eyes. For 3 years running, she'd been re-elected unopposed, mostly because nobody wanted to deal with her wrath if they lost. My father, Richard Cole, had lived in that house for 30 years, quietly, kindly, mowing his lawn every Saturday like clockwork. When he died, I inherited the house, the garage, and the Camaro he loved more than almost anything in this world. I parked the Camaro in the driveway the week I moved in, still wrapped in a fitted car cover, waiting for a warmer weekend to finally drive it. I had no idea that simple decision would ignite a war. 3 days later, a yellow notice appeared on my door, taped crookedly like it had been slapped on in anger. Violation: unauthorized vehicle storage in driveway. Remove within 48 hours or vehicle will be towed at owner's expense. I laughed at first. Surely this was a mistake. A covered, parked car in my own driveway couldn't be a violation. I called the HOA office, and a tired-sounding assistant named Priya told me Karen had personally flagged the vehicle herself. She said it looked abandoned, Priya said, her voice careful, like she was choosing every word around a landmine. I decided to handle it like an adult. I knocked on Karen's door with the actual HOA bylaws printed out, highlighted, ready to reason with her. She opened the door in a cardigan the color of dried blood, looked at my papers, and said, "Rules are rules, sweetheart. It's registered, insured, and covered," I said. "It's not abandoned. It's my father's car. He just passed away." Her expression didn't soften even slightly. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before parking junk in a family neighborhood." That word, junk, would come back to haunt her in ways she couldn't possibly imagine yet. I told her I'd get it moved into the garage within the week, once I finished clearing out boxes my father left behind. She nodded slowly, almost sweetly, and said, "You have until Friday." Something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. I didn't know yet that Friday was never really a deadline. It was a trap already set in motion. My father had loved this neighborhood once, back when the HOA was run by a retired teacher who cared more about roses than power. Karen took over 5 years ago after a contentious election, and the whole community changed overnight, like a storm rolling in. Fences got violation notices for being an inch too tall. Mailboxes got fined for the wrong shade of black. People said Karen kept a private folder on every resident, tracking infractions like a detective building a case nobody asked for. I should have taken that rumor more seriously than I did. Thursday night, I worked late clearing out my father's workshop, sorting through decades of tools, photographs, and grease-stained manuals. I found a small leather notebook where he'd logged every hour he spent restoring the Camaro, nearly 4,000 hours across 2 decades. I fell asleep on the couch surrounded by his memories, exhausted, still planning to move the car into the garage first thing Friday morning. I never got the chance. I woke up to a driveway that was completely, sickeningly empty. My heart dropped into my stomach before my mind even processed what I was seeing. The car cover lay crumpled on the pavement like a shed skin, and tire tracks curved out toward the street. I called the police first, certain it had been stolen in the night by some random criminal. An officer arrived within 20 minutes, looked at the tracks, and said something that made my blood run cold. This wasn't a random theft. Someone authorized a tow. I called the HOA office in a panic, and Priya, sounding genuinely shaken, said Karen had ordered an emergency tow at 6 a.m. that morning. She said the deadline had passed, Priya whispered. "But sir, the notice said Friday. Today is Thursday." That single sentence would become the crack that eventually brought Karen's entire kingdom crashing down. I drove straight to the towing company, Higgins Auto Recovery, my hands trembling on the wheel the entire way. The dispatcher, a heavy-set man named Doug, pulled up the paperwork and frowned. "This says junk removal, not tow and hold." It went straight to the crusher lot. "The crusher lot?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "That's a junkyard. You crush cars there." Doug's face went pale. "Sir, I need to make a call." We drove 20 minutes to Ferris Salvage and Scrap, a rusted yard on the edge of town filled with mangled metal skeletons. I ran between rows of crushed vehicles, screaming my father's license plate number like it was a prayer. And then I saw it, a flattened rectangle of blue steel, barely recognizable, sitting on top of a pile destined for the shredder. My father's Camaro. 22 years of his life. Gone in 4,000 seconds. I dropped to my knees right there in the gravel and I did not care who saw me cry. The yard manager checked his intake sheet, confused. The paperwork said, owner consented to scrap. Vehicle deemed abandoned junk. Signed by a Karen Whitfield. Signed by Karen. Not by me. Not by anyone with any legal right to sign anything about my father's car. That was the moment grief turned into something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous, purpose. I didn't scream at Karen that day. I didn't even go home right away. I sat in my car outside the salvage yard for 2 hours, and I made myself a promise. I was going to take everything from her. Not with fists. Not with shouting matches on her porch. With paper. With law. With receipts she never thought anyone would check. I was a paralegal for 11 years before switching careers. And Karen had just declared war on exactly the wrong person. By the time I drove home, I had already started a list in my phone titled simply, Evidence. Little did Karen know. The woman who crushed my father's legacy had just handed me the first piece of rope to hang her own reputation with. I am, by nature, a patient man. My father used to say patience was the only tool that never rusted. So instead of pounding on Karen's door, I drove to the county recorder's office the very next morning. I requested every HOA document filed in the last 5 years, meeting minutes, financial statements, violation logs, everything public record allowed. What I found in the first hour alone made my jaw tighten. Karen had issued 41 emergency removal orders in 3 years, every single one bypassing the mandatory 72-hour appeal window written into the actual bylaws. 41 families. 41 people who probably thought, like I did, that this was just bad luck. I photographed every page, cataloged every date, cross-referenced every signature against the official HOA president authority limits. Karen had never once had legal authority to authorize a scrap and destroy order on anyone's vehicle. Ever. I requested the security footage from the community's front gate camera, the one facing my own driveway, citing my right as an affected resident. Priya, bless her nervous heart, emailed it to me within the hour, almost like she wanted it out of her hands as fast as possible. The footage showed Karen herself, at 5:47 a.m., standing in my driveway in her bathrobe, personally flagging down the tow truck. She wasn't reporting a violation. She was orchestrating one, alone, before the sun had even fully risen. I sat there replaying the footage 6 times, watching her point toward the Camaro with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. That's when I noticed something small in the corner of the frame, a second car parked just down the street, engine running, headlights off. I zoomed in as far as the footage allowed. It was a black sedan registered, I would later learn, to Ferris Salvage and Scrap's owner himself. Karen hadn't just ordered a tow. She had a prearranged appointment with the junkyard before my deadline had even technically expired. This wasn't an overzealous HOA president enforcing rules. This was premeditated. I began quietly interviewing the 41 families from the removal logs, one modest conversation at a time, careful never to tip Karen off. Most were terrified to speak, still living under Karen's rule, still receiving her little yellow notices like ransom letters. But one woman, an elderly widow named Marjorie Fenn, agreed to meet me at a diner 2 towns over, far from Meadow Hollow's watchful eyes. Marjorie had lost her late husband's fishing boat trailer to an emergency removal 18 months earlier. No appeal. No warning beyond 24 hours instead of the required 72. I always wondered why she moved so fast, Marjorie said, stirring her coffee. Almost like she enjoyed it. I asked her the one question that had been eating at me: did Karen ever personally profit from any of these removals? Marjorie's eyes narrowed. Funny you ask. My trailer disappeared from the junkyard within a week. Someone bought the scrap metal rights for cash. A chill ran down my spine. If Karen was selling salvage rights before residents even knew their property was destroyed, this wasn't rule enforcement. This was theft. Dressed up in a homeowners association polo shirt, I drove to Ferris Salvage that same afternoon, this time not to grieve, but to investigate. I asked the owner, a wiry man named Chester Ferris, whether Karen Whitfield had a standing financial arrangement with his yard. Chester went quiet, glancing toward the back office like he expected someone to be listening. I probably shouldn't say this, he finally muttered, but she gets a cut. Every vehicle she sends me, she gets 20% of scrap value. Cash. My hands curled into fists at my sides. 20%. My father's 22 years of love, reduced to a percentage on Karen Whitfield's kickback sheet. Do you have records? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Chester hesitated, then sighed. I keep everything. Man in my business learns to keep everything, in case someone comes asking exactly what you're asking. He walked to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled, almost comically, KW. Referrals. 41 names. 41 payout amounts. 41 signatures that were never, ever hers legally to give. I photographed every page with shaking hands, my heart pounding somewhere between fury and disbelief. Karen Whitfield hadn't just abused her power. She'd built a quiet little criminal enterprise disguised as neighborhood beautification. I left the junkyard that day with something my father never got the chance to have: real leverage. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, mapping out charges: theft, fraud, forgery, breach of fiduciary duty, unauthorized disposal of property. I wasn't just going to complain to a board anymore. I was going to bury Karen Whitfield in the exact paperwork she loved so much. The next morning, I drove to the county sheriff's office and filed a formal report for grand theft auto and destruction of property. The detective assigned, a tired but sharp woman named Detective Reyes, raised an eyebrow the moment I laid Chester's folder on her desk. You built half my case for me already, she said, flipping through the kickback records. This is going to be a very bad week for Mrs. Whitfield. Word travels fast in a gated community, and by Tuesday, everyone at Meadow Hollow knew a resident had filed a police report against Karen. She responded the only way she knew how, with intimidation, disguised as HOA authority. A new notice appeared on my door within hours. Complaint filed. Resident found in violation of HOA Harassment Clause 14.2. Fine, $500. There was no such clause. I checked. Twice. Karen was inventing violations on the fly now. Desperate, sloppy, and it only strengthened the case building silently against her. I laughed out loud reading that notice, standing on my own porch. For the first time since the funeral, my neighbor across the street, a quiet man named Frank Delgado, wandered over that evening with 2 beers and an apology. I should have warned you, Frank said. She did something similar to my brother's boat 2 years ago. I was too scared to say anything. Fear, I realized, was the real currency Karen operated in, not community, not bylaws, just fear wearing a homeowner association badge. I told Frank about the kickback folder, and his face went through disbelief, then fury, then something like hope. If you're building a case, he said, I've got a security camera pointed at my own driveway. It caught her doing something weird last spring. Frank's footage showed Karen, late one night, siphoning gasoline out of a resident's boat before reporting it for unsafe fuel storage the next morning. Another manufactured violation. Another convenient excuse to seize and sell someone's property. The pattern was staggeringly consistent. Manufacture the crisis, enforce the emergency, collect the cash from Chester's scrapyard. I brought Frank's footage straight to Detective Reyes, who was starting to look less tired and more like a woman closing in on something big. We're going to need a warrant for her financial records, Reyes said. And possibly her HOA email account. For the first time since the Crusher lot, I let myself believe that justice might actually be a real, achievable thing. 2 weeks passed in a strange, tense quiet, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath waiting for the next explosion. Karen, sensing something shifting beneath her polished suburban armor, began acting strangely friendlier, almost desperate to seem beloved. She started hosting community appreciation barbecues, smiling for photos, handing out lemonade like she hadn't personally destroyed a dead man's legacy. I attended one, not because I forgave her, but because I wanted to watch her perform up close. One last time before the curtain fell. She approached me by the drink table, her smile stretched painfully thin. I heard you filed a little report. Silly misunderstanding, don't you think? 41 families don't sound like a misunderstanding. Karen, I said quietly. They sound like a pattern. Her smile flickered for just a second, one crack in the porcelain, before she recovered and walked away without another word. That flicker told me everything. She knew. She'd always known exactly what she was doing. That night, Detective Reyes called with news that made me sit down on the kitchen floor. Phone pressed hard to my ear. The warrant had gone through. Karen's personal bank account showed over $86,000 in unexplained cash deposits over 3 years, matching Chester's kickback folder almost dollar for dollar. We're also finding falsified board meeting minutes, Reyes added. Looks like she forged signatures approving her own emergency removal authority. Forged signatures. My father's neighbors' names? Signed without their knowledge. To give Karen power she never legally possessed. I asked the question that had haunted me since the Crusher lot. Is there anything that can bring the car back? Reyes was quiet for a moment. No. But we can make sure she never touches anyone else's property again. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was, finally, the answer I needed to hear. The HOA board scheduled an emergency meeting the following Thursday, though none of them knew yet just how emergency it truly was. I arrived early, sat in the front row, and set a manila folder on my lap like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. Karen took her usual seat at the head of the table, gavel in hand, completely unaware the room was about to turn against her. First order of business, she began, addressing false accusations being spread by a certain disgruntled resident. Actually, Detective Reyes said, stepping through the door in full uniform, I think we should address the actual business first. The color drained from Karen's face so fast it was almost comedic, if the situation weren't so devastating. Reyes laid out the evidence methodically, the forged signatures, the kickback folder, the falsified violation notices, the fabricated 24-hour deadlines. Every board member sat frozen, watching their queen's crown crack in real time under fluorescent community room lighting. This is a misunderstanding, Karen stammered, echoing the exact excuse she'd given me 2 weeks earlier. I was acting in the community's best interest. Your best interest, I said, standing up, voice shaking but steady, was 20% of my father's car. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone dropped a coffee cup. Frank, sitting in the back, actually laughed out loud. Karen's eyes darted toward the exit like a cornered animal calculating escape routes that didn't exist anymore. You have the right to remain silent, Reyes said, stepping forward with handcuffs glinting under the ceiling lights. I never imagined I would watch Karen Whitfield get arrested inside the very clubhouse she'd ruled like a personal palace. The sound of those handcuffs clicking shut felt, for one brief moment, exactly like justice. But arrest was only the beginning. Karen still had lawyers, still had money, still had a reputation she'd spend a fortune trying to protect. She was released on bail within hours, and the following week her attorney called mine. Yes, I'd hired one, a sharp litigator named Patricia Nguyen. My client would like to offer a settlement, the attorney said smoothly. A modest sum. In exchange for dropping all civil claims. Patricia glanced at me across her desk. They're offering $15,000. That's insulting, considering what we actually have. I thought of my father's 4,000 restoration hours, his leather notebook, 22 years reduced to a crushed steel cube. Tell them no, I said. Tell them we're filing for the full civil case. Grand theft, fraud, emotional distress. Everything. Karen's lawyer called back within the hour, this time offering $50,000. urgency creeping into his voice like a man realizing his client had badly miscalculated. We refused again. This was never really about the money, though I wouldn't turn down what was rightfully owed. Word of the arrest spread through Meadow Hollow like wildfire through dry summer grass. And suddenly, quiet neighbors weren't quiet anymore. Marjorie Fenn called Detective Reyes directly, offering her own trailer records as supporting testimony for the growing criminal case. 3 more families came forward within days, each with their own version of the same story: sudden deadlines, mysterious removals, missing property. The HOA board, terrified of liability, voted unanimously to suspend Karen's presidency pending the outcome of both the criminal and civil proceedings. For the first time in 5 years, Meadow Hollow held an emergency election without her fingerprints anywhere on the ballot process. Frank Delgado, of all people, was nominated as interim president, and he accepted with a grin aimed directly at Karen's old office window. I found myself, strangely, becoming something of a neighborhood hero, the man who finally exposed the queen everyone had been too afraid to challenge. But heroism didn't fill the empty space in my garage where my father's Camaro should have been sitting, gleaming under a shop light. Grief and vindication, I was learning, could exist in the exact same breath, tangled together in ways that never fully untangled. Karen's criminal trial date was set for 8 weeks out, and in the meantime, our civil suit moved forward with brutal efficiency. Patricia deposed Chester Ferris under oath, and he confirmed every kickback payment on record. His voice flat, resigned, done protecting a woman who'd never protected him. She deposed Priya, the HOA assistant, who finally admitted she'd been ordered to backdate several notices to make deadlines appear legitimate after the fact. Backdated documents, forged appeal windows, a 5-year paper trail of manufactured emergencies designed to fund Karen's private scrap metal side business. Every deposition added another brick to a wall that was quickly becoming impossible for Karen to climb over. Then came the twist I never saw coming. Buried in financial records Patricia's investigator dug up almost by accident. Karen Whitfield wasn't just running a kickback scheme. She was drowning in debt, over $140,000 owed on a second mortgage she'd hidden from her own husband. Her scrap metal scheme wasn't greed for greed's sake. It was a desperate woman trying to bail water out of a sinking financial ship, one crushed car at a time. It didn't excuse what she did. Nothing could excuse what she did. But it explained the frantic, escalating recklessness of her final months in power. Even more shocking, records showed her husband, Gerald, had filed for divorce the week after her arrest, citing irreconcilable financial deception. The Queen of Meadow Hollow was losing her crown, her marriage, and her freedom, all in the span of 2 brutal months. I felt something unexpected watching it all unravel, not joy exactly, but a grim, exhausted sense of a scale finally balancing. My father used to say the universe keeps better records than any of us realize. I was starting to believe he'd been right all along. The criminal trial began on a gray Tuesday morning, courtroom benches filled with more Meadow Hollow residents than I'd ever seen at any HOA meeting. Karen sat at the defense table in a modest gray blazer, hair still pulled tight, though the confidence had drained clean out of her posture. The prosecution opened with the kickback folder, walking the jury through 41 names, 41 dates, 41 betrayed families. Then came the security footage, Karen in her bathrobe at 5:47 a.m., orchestrating my father's Camaro's destruction a full day before any deadline expired. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the footage played, and I watched several jurors' faces harden with something close to disgust. Chester Ferris testified next, confirming under oath the exact cash arrangement. His voice steady despite Karen's icy glare from across the courtroom. "She'd call me the night before," Chester said. "Tell me who to expect." Sometimes before the notice was even posted on their door. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "Premeditation," she said simply. "Not enforcement. Premeditation." Marjorie Fenn testified about her husband's fishing trailer, her voice cracking as she described learning it had been sold for scrap within a week. Frank's footage of the siphon gasoline played next. Another manufactured emergency. Another convenient excuse dressed up as community safety. When it was my turn to testify, I brought my father's leather notebook, the one logging 4,000 restoration hours across 22 years. I read a single entry aloud. Dated the year I turned 16, taught Alex to change the oil today. He got grease on his shirt. Best day. The courtroom went completely silent. Even Karen's attorney seemed to flinch. That car wasn't junk, I said, looking directly at Karen for the first time since her arrest. It was every Saturday my father ever loved me. Karen looked away first. She always looked away first. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity due to financial stress, painting Karen as a desperate woman rather than a calculated predator. But the jury had already seen the pattern. 5 years, 41 families. One methodical scheme dressed up in a laminated rulebook. Closing arguments took less time than I expected. The evidence, honestly, had already made its own case long before anyone stood to speak. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, though it felt, sitting in that hallway, like 6 brutal years. When they filed back in, I held my breath so hard my chest actually ached. On the count of grand theft auto, we find the defendant guilty. The room exhaled all at once. A collective sound I will remember for the rest of my life. On the count of fraud, guilty. On the count of forgery, guilty. On the count of breach of fiduciary duty, guilty. 4 counts. For unanimous, thunderous confirmations that everything I'd spent 2 months building had actually mattered. Karen's face went completely blank, like she genuinely hadn't believed, until that exact second, that this could really happen to her. The judge set sentencing for 3 weeks later, releasing her on strict house arrest with an ankle monitor in the meantime. I walked out of that courthouse into painfully bright afternoon sunlight, and for the first time since the Crusher lot, I actually felt like breathing. Frank clapped me on the shoulder in the parking lot. "Your dad would be proud of you, man." Genuinely. I nodded, unable to speak, watching Karen being led toward a car by her lawyer. Her once perfect posture completely collapsed. The civil case settled 2 days later. Once her attorney realized a criminal conviction made further resistance financially suicidal. Karen was ordered to pay full restitution for the Camaro's appraised restoration value, plus damages for emotional distress and legal fees, $312,000 total. It would never bring the car back. Nothing could. But it was, finally, something close to accountability. Sentencing day arrived cold and overcast. Fitting weather for the end of Karen Whitfield's reign over Meadow Hollow Estates. The judge cited the calculated nature of her scheme, the years-long pattern, and the deliberate exploitation of grieving, vulnerable homeowners. 41 families trusted you to protect their community, the judge said. You turned that trust into a personal criminal enterprise. Karen was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, along with a permanent ban from ever holding an HOA leadership position again. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. Even in that final moment, she simply stared straight ahead, jaw tight, refusing to concede a single inch. I almost respected the stubbornness, in a strange, exhausted way. Almost. As deputies led her out of the courtroom for the final time, she turned briefly, catching my eye across the gallery. "It was just a car," she said, quiet enough that only I could hear it. "It was my father," I said back. And that was the last thing I ever said to Karen Whitfield. Meadow Hollow held its first real, honest election the following month, and Frank Delgado was voted in as permanent president, unopposed but earned. The new board's first act was rewriting the bylaws entirely, adding mandatory appeal windows, independent audits, and term limits nobody could quietly ignore again. A little yellow notice would never again mean the same thing to the families of Meadow Hollow Estates. Chester Ferris, facing his own charges for knowingly participating in the scheme, avoided prison by fully cooperating and surrendering every dollar of illicit profit. Priya kept her job under the new board, finally free to enforce rules honestly instead of backdating documents under threat. I used part of the restitution money to fund a small community scholarship in my father's name, for kids interested in auto restoration and mechanics. It felt right. Somehow. Turning Karen's cruelty into something my father would have actually recognized as good. Marjorie Fenn stopped by my house one afternoon with a pie, thanking me for something I didn't fully feel like I deserved thanks for. "You gave 41 families their voice back," she said. "That's not nothing, Alexander. That's everything. I still don't have my father's Camaro. I never will again. Some losses don't get undone, no matter how much justice follows them. But I have his leather notebook. 4,000 hours of memories in his own handwriting, sitting on my nightstand where I read a page every night. Some evenings I sit in my empty garage, the space where the car should be, and I just remember him teaching me to change that oil. Grief doesn't disappear just because justice arrives. It just learns, eventually, to sit a little more quietly beside you. Karen Whitfield is currently serving her sentence in a state facility 2 hours from Meadow Hollow, her name permanently barred from any future HOA role. Gerald finalized their divorce quietly, keeping the house, selling off whatever remained of the life she'd built on other people's stolen property. Meadow Hollow feels different now, lighter somehow, like a whole neighborhood finally exhaled a breath it had been holding for 5 long years. I still drive past Ferris Salvage sometimes, though Chester sold the business shortly after the trial and moved out of state entirely. My father used to say a man's true legacy isn't the things he builds, but the people he protects along the way, and I finally understood exactly what he meant. I never got my father's car back, but I got something he'd have valued even more, proof that patience, evidence, and quiet resolve can bring down even the cruelest queen of the cul-de-sac.